I never imagined my life would become this quiet. Not the peaceful kind of quiet. The kind where your phone stops ringing. Where holidays pass without plans. Where your own name feels strange when no one says it anymore. The night my family cut me off, I sat alone on the edge of my bed and listened to the refrigerator hum in the other room. That sound became my company. No voices. No messages. No anger shouted through walls. Just silence. Heavy and final. I kept asking myself one question. How did I end up here? I had done what I thought was right. I had worked. I had provided. I had stayed when things were hard. And yet, somehow, I was the one left behind. The one erased. The one expected to disappear quietly and not make anyone uncomfortable with my pain. That was the night I realized something that scared me more than being alone. I had no idea how to survive without my family. And even worse, I had no idea who I was without them. I grew up believing family was everything. Not in a loud or dramatic way. Just in the way it was always there. Like air. You didn't talk about it. You didn't question it. You just breathed it in and assumed it would never run out. My parents were not perfect people, but they were present. My father worked long hours and came home tired. My mother kept the house together in quiet ways that only made sense later in life. There were rules. There were expectations. There was love, even if it was not always spoken. I was the oldest son. That meant something in our family. It meant responsibility before freedom. Duty before desire. You don't complain. You don't wander. You stay close. You help. You protect. You carry weight so others don't have to. I learned early how to swallow my feelings. How to nod instead of argue. How to say it's fine, even when it wasn't. People praised me for being mature, reliable, steady. No one asked how heavy that role felt. I married young. Not because I was in a rush, but because it felt like the next expected step. My wife came into the family easily at first. My parents liked her. My siblings welcomed her. We built a life that looked solid from the outside. A small house, regular routines, shared holidays. I believed that if I kept showing up, kept doing the right thing, everything would stay in place. That belief lasted longer than it should have. The cracks didn't appear all at once. They never do. It started with small disagreements. Different opinions about money. About boundaries. About how much time we spent with my parents. Nothing explosive. Just tension that settled into conversations like dust. My wife began pulling back. Not from me exactly, but from them. She felt judged. Watched. Corrected. I tried to smooth things over. I explained her side to my family. I explained my family to her. I became the middle space where conflict lived. I told myself this was normal. Families argue. Marriages stretch. Strong people hold things together. So I held. And held. And held. Until one day, I realized no one was holding me. The first real break happened over something small. At least, that's what it looked like. A family gathering. A comment made at the table. A look exchanged between my mother and my wife. Silence that lingered too long. I felt it immediately. That shift in the air when something has gone wrong, but no one says it out loud. Later that night, my wife cried. She said she felt alone. Unsupported. Like she was always the outsider. I listened. I held her. I promised to do better. The next day, my mother called. She sounded hurt. Confused. She said my wife had changed. That things were different now. I listened again. I reassured. I promised to talk to her. That was my pattern. Absorb. Translate. Apologize. Repeat. What I didn't see was how slowly that role was breaking me down. Weeks turned into months. Conversations turned colder. Invitations became shorter. My presence felt conditional, like I had to arrive already prepared to defend myself or someone else. Then came the day I was asked to choose. Not directly. Not with those words. But the message was clear. I was told my priorities were wrong. That I had let my wife disrespect the family. That I needed to fix things if I wanted peace. When I asked what fixing meant, the answer made my chest tighten. It meant distance. From her. Or from them. I didn't choose immediately. I couldn't. I thought time would soften things. That cooler heads would prevail. Instead, silence began to grow. Calls stopped first. Then visits. Then messages. When I reached out, replies were short. Polite. Empty. I told myself they were busy. Hurt. Processing. But deep down, I knew something was ending. The final moment came without drama. No shouting. No slammed doors. Just a conversation that ended with words I still hear clearly. We need space from you. Not from us. From you. I remember nodding. Saying I understood. thanking them for being honest. I was calm on the phone. I fell apart after. That night, I sat alone and felt something unfamiliar. Not anger, not even sadness. It was a hollow feeling, like something essential had been removed and my body hadn't realized it yet. Days passed, then weeks. No follow-up, no clarification, no bridge back. I tried once more. A message sent carefully, respectfully. It went unanswered. That was when the truth settled in. I had been cut off, not as punishment, as a decision. And suddenly, every part of my life felt unstable. My marriage was strained. My family was gone. My identity felt unfinished. I woke up each morning unsure of where I belonged. Simple things became heavy. Grocery shopping, eating alone, sitting in a quiet house that no longer felt shared by invisible connections. I realized how much of my sense of self had been built around being someone's son, someone's brother, someone who belonged to a group that knew his history without explanation. Now, I was just a man in a quiet room. People talk about independence like it's empowering. They don't talk enough about how terrifying it feels when independence is forced on you. I had no roadmap for this version of life. No one had taught me how to stand alone emotionally, how to grieve people who were still alive, how to stop waiting for a message that might never come. Some nights, I replayed every conversation in my head, searching for the exact moment where I failed. Other nights, I felt numb, empty, too tired to care. What hurt the most was not being missed. At least, not openly. No one asked how I was surviving. No one checked if I was okay. It made me question my worth in ways I had never allowed myself to before. Was I only valuable when I was useful? Was love conditional all along? Those questions didn't have answers yet. All I knew was this. If I didn't learn how to survive on my own, I was going to disappear inside this silence. And so, without knowing how, or where it would lead, I took my first step into a life I never planned. A life without the people I thought would always be there. And this is how that journey truly began. The first weeks after everything went quiet felt unreal. I still moved through my days out of habit. I woke up at the same time. I went to work. I answered emails. I smiled at people when they spoke to me. From the outside, nothing looked broken. But inside, everything felt loose, like parts of me were no longer connected properly. I kept expecting the silence to end. I would feel my phone vibrate and reach for it too quickly, my heart lifting for a second before sinking again. Most of the time it was nothing important. A notification, an ad, a reminder, never their names. At night, the quiet became louder. During the day, noise distracted me. Traffic, conversations, the simple sounds of life moving forward. But at night, when the world slowed down, my thoughts had nowhere to hide. I replayed memories I hadn't touched in years. Family dinners where everyone talked over each other. My father clearing his throat before saying something serious. My mother asking if I had eaten enough. My siblings arguing over small things that didn't matter. Those memories felt warm and painful at the same time. It was strange how something that once felt ordinary could suddenly feel unreachable. My wife noticed the change in me before I admitted it to myself. She asked gently at first if I was okay, if I wanted to talk. I told her I was just tired, that work had been stressful, that I needed time. That was partly true, but the deeper truth was harder to say out loud. I felt like I had failed at the one role I had always believed defined me. Being a son, being a bridge, being someone who could keep people together. Now, I was the common point in a story where everyone else had stepped away. There were moments when I felt resentment rise up, quiet but sharp. I wondered why no one had tried harder to understand me. Why my loyalty had been questioned so easily. Why love had turned into distance without a real conversation. But the resentment never stayed long. It softened into sadness, then into guilt. I questioned every decision I had made, every word I had said. I wondered if I should have pushed back more, or less, if I should have defended my wife harder, or my parents, if choosing balance had made me lose everything. That kind of thinking doesn't lead anywhere good. It just circles. My wife carried her own weight through all of this. She didn't celebrate the distance. She didn't feel victorious. She felt uncomfortable with it, unsure how to support me without reopening wounds. Sometimes I could tell she felt responsible, even when she never said it. I didn't want her to carry that, so I kept more inside. That decision came at a cost. Silence, when shared, can feel safe. Silence, when carried alone, becomes heavy. Weeks turned into months. No birthdays acknowledged. No holidays mentioned. Seasons changed without ceremony. I remember the first major holiday after the cutoff. I stood in the grocery store, staring at a shelf of greeting cards. Cards for parents. Cards for siblings. Cards full of words about love and gratitude. I didn't pick up a single one. I walked out of the store with nothing in my hands and a tight feeling in my chest that stayed with me the rest of the day. That was the moment I understood this wasn't temporary. This wasn't a pause. This was my new reality, and I had no idea how to live inside it. I began to notice how much of my emotional life had been shaped by my family's presence. My confidence, my sense of direction, even my ability to make decisions. Without them, I second-guessed everything. Small choices felt overwhelming. What to do on weekends? Who to call when something good or bad happened? Where I fit when people asked about my family. I started avoiding certain questions. How are your parents? Do you see your siblings often? I learned to answer politely, but vaguely. They're fine. Everyone's busy. It was easier than explaining a pain that felt too personal for casual conversation. Some nights, I found myself sitting in the dark, thinking about the younger version of me. The boy who believed family was permanent. The man who assumed loyalty would always be returned. I wanted to tell him that life was more complicated than that. But I also didn't want to take away his hope. There was a moment, late one night, when I realized something important. I wasn't just grieving my family. I was grieving the future I thought we would share. The aging parents I imagined caring for. The holidays I assumed would continue. The quiet understanding that comes from shared history. That future had dissolved without ceremony. And I was left standing in the present, unsure how to move forward without looking back constantly. That was when survival stopped being an abstract idea. It became urgent. I couldn't keep living in waiting mode. Waiting for an apology. Waiting for a message. Waiting for things to return to how they were. If I did, I would waste my life hoping for something I couldn't control. So I started small. Painfully small. I focused on routines. Waking up at the same time every day. Making my bed. Eating meals even when I didn't feel hungry. These things might sound simple, even meaningless. But they gave my days shape. They reminded me that I was still here. I began taking walks alone in the evenings. No music. No phone. Just movement and thought. At first, my mind filled the silence with questions and regret. But over time, something else appeared. Space. Space to feel without rushing to fix anything. Space to sit with emotions instead of pushing them away. I noticed how tired I had been for years. Not physically. Emotionally. I had spent so much time managing relationships, smoothing conflict, holding myself steady for others, that I had forgotten what it felt like to check in with myself. Now, I had no choice. That realization didn't make the pain disappear, but it gave it meaning. I started writing. Not for anyone else. Just for myself. I wrote about anger I didn't feel allowed to express. About sadness that didn't fit neatly into words. About fear that I would always be this alone. Some nights, I wrote until my hand hurt. Other nights, I couldn't write at all. Both were okay. I was learning to be patient with myself in a way I never had before. Slowly, I began to see how deeply I had tied my worth to my role in the family. Being needed had made me feel valuable. Without that role, I felt invisible. That was a dangerous realization, because it meant I had never fully learned how to value myself without external approval. That lesson hurt, but it also opened a door. If my worth didn't come from being useful to others, then it had to come from somewhere else. I just didn't know where yet. There were setbacks, days when the loneliness felt unbearable, moments when I nearly reached out again, desperate to feel connected, even if it meant being hurt. But I stopped myself, not out of pride, out of self-respect. I was learning, slowly, that survival wasn't about proving anything to anyone else. It was about staying whole in the absence of validation. That understanding didn't arrive all at once. It grew quietly, like a muscle being used for the first time. And even though I still felt lost, still felt the ache of separation every day, something inside me had shifted. For the first time since my family cut me off, I wasn't just enduring the silence. I was listening to it. And in that silence, I was beginning to hear myself. The conflict didn't end when the silence began. If anything, that was when it truly settled inside me. Without daily noise or distraction, the past grew louder. Conversations replayed themselves with new weight. Words I had brushed aside before now returned with sharp edges. I started to see how long the tension had been building. Even when I had convinced myself everything was fine, I had always believed conflict looked like shouting or slammed doors. But in my family, conflict was quieter. It lived in pauses, in carefully chosen words, in looks exchanged when someone said the wrong thing. Growing up, we didn't argue openly. We adjusted. We adapted. We avoided. And I learned early that keeping the peace often meant staying quiet. That habit followed me into adulthood. When my wife first told me she felt uncomfortable around my family, I didn't dismiss her. I listened, but I also minimized. I told her they didn't mean harm, that they were just particular, that this was how they showed concern. I believed that explanation myself. It was easier than confronting the possibility that love and control sometimes were the same face. As time went on, the comments became more pointed. Questions about how we spent our money, suggestions about how we should live, small corrections offered in front of others, wrapped in humor or concern. I saw it, but I also saw how normal it had always felt. To my wife, it felt different. It felt like judgment. She tried to bring it up calmly. She chose her words carefully, afraid of hurting me. She said she felt like she was constantly being measured against expectations she never agreed to. I told her I understood. And I did. But understanding something and acting on it are two very different things. When I spoke to my family, I softened everything. I turned concerns into misunderstandings. I asked for patience instead of boundaries. I thought compromise would protect everyone. Instead, it made everyone feel unheard. The real breaking point came during a visit that was supposed to be simple. A weekend, a meal, familiar faces. Nothing dramatic. But tension has a way of filling space when it's ignored for too long. There was a comment made about our choices. Casual, almost playful, but it landed hard. I saw my wife's expression change. I felt my own chest tighten. This time, I didn't brush it off. I said something. Not loudly, not aggressively, just enough to acknowledge that it crossed a line. The room went quiet. That kind of quiet that makes your ears ring. My mother looked surprised. My father looked uncomfortable. My siblings looked away. It was as if I had broken an unspoken rule. Afterward, I was told I had embarrassed them, that I had chosen the wrong time, the wrong tone, the wrong side. I remember standing there, nodding, apologizing, even though part of me felt something crack. Because for the first time, I had chosen honesty over harmony, and it had cost me. The conversations after that became colder, not openly hostile, just distant. When I tried to explain my perspective, I was told I was being influenced, that I wasn't myself anymore, that my priorities had shifted in the wrong direction. Those words stayed with me, not because they were cruel, but because they questioned my autonomy. It felt like my adulthood was being revoked. I started noticing how often my feelings were framed as problems to be solved rather than truths to be understood. If I was upset, I was told to calm down. If I set a boundary, I was told I was being difficult. If I tried to balance both sides, I was told I was failing everyone. No matter what I did, it felt wrong. The pressure built quietly. Phone calls became tense. Visits became shorter. I began to feel like I had to prepare myself emotionally before any interaction. I loved them. That never stopped. But love started to feel conditional, based on compliance, based on agreement, based on silence. At the same time, my marriage was struggling under the weight of all this. My wife felt like she was living in a constant state of evaluation. She tried to be respectful. She tried to fit in. But the effort was exhausting. She asked me once, late at night, why I never seemed angry. That question caught me off guard. I didn't have an answer. I realized I had learned to turn anger inward instead of expressing it, to redirect it into responsibility, into self-blame. That coping strategy had worked for years, until it didn't. I began feeling trapped between two worlds, each expecting loyalty, each disappointed by my attempts at balance. There were moments when I thought about walking away from everyone just to breathe. But that thought scared me. Family had always been my anchor. Losing them felt like losing gravity. The final argument didn't explode. It settled. It arrived through disappointment rather than rage. I was told they felt disrespected, that my actions had consequences, that space would be healthy for everyone. I tried to ask what space meant. How long? Under what conditions? With what expectations? The answers were vague. I left that conversation with a knot in my stomach and a sense that something irreversible had been set in motion. Days later, the distance became official. No calls, no messages, no invitations, just absence. I kept waiting for a follow-up, for a clarification, for some sign that this was temporary. It never came. That's when the conflict stopped being about disagreement. It became about loss. I realized that standing up, even gently, had changed how I was seen. I was no longer the reliable one, the easy one, the son who absorbed discomfort to keep things smooth. I had become complicated, and complicated people are often pushed away rather than understood. That realization hurt deeply, but it also forced me to confront something I had avoided my entire life. Peace that requires self-erasure is not peace. It is survival disguised as harmony. I had mistaken endurance for strength. And now, the cost of that mistake was silence. A silence that didn't just separate me from my family, but from the version of myself I thought I had to be in order to be loved. That understanding marked the beginning of my fall. Not the dramatic kind, the quiet kind, where you realize the ground you've been standing on was never as solid as you believed. And once you see that truth, you can't unsee it, even if it breaks your heart. The fall didn't happen all at once. There was no single moment where everything collapsed. No clear sound of something breaking. It was more like a slow lowering, a steady descent I didn't realize was happening until I was already deep inside it. I stopped reaching out. At first, it was because I didn't want to be rejected again. Later, it was because I didn't know what I would even say. Every message felt like it would either reopen wounds or confirm how far apart we had grown. So I stayed quiet. That silence, which had once been forced on me, slowly became something I chose. Not because it felt good, but because it felt safer. The days began to blur together. I went to work. I came home. I ate dinner without much thought. I slept, but never deeply. I carried a constant weight in my chest, like something unfinished was pressing against my ribs. People around me noticed I was quieter. They asked if I was okay. I said yes. I said it so often that it almost sounded true. But inside, I felt hollow. There were moments when I questioned my own memories. Was it really that bad? Had I overreacted? Was I holding on to hurt that didn't matter as much as I thought? That kind of doubt is dangerous. It makes you rewrite your own experience to make others more comfortable. Some nights, I lay awake thinking about calling my parents, apologizing for everything, even things I didn't fully understand. I imagined their voices, familiar and distant at the same time. But then I imagined what would come after. Conditions. Unspoken expectations. The slow return of pressure to be who I had always been. And I couldn't do it. Not anymore. That realization filled me with both relief and grief. Relief, because I was finally listening to myself. Grief, because listening to myself meant accepting that some doors might stay closed. My marriage suffered quietly during this time. Not from conflict, but from exhaustion. I was emotionally drained. My wife tried to support me, but she was carrying her own sadness too. We spoke less. We shared space more than connection. There were evenings when we sat on opposite sides of the room, each lost in our own thoughts, unsure how to reach each other without touching the pain between us. I worried that my inner collapse would take everything with it. That fear made me withdraw further. I thought if I could just hold myself together long enough, things would stabilize. Instead, I felt myself slipping further away. One night, I broke down alone in the bathroom. I don't know what triggered it. Maybe it was something small. A memory. A song. A passing thought. I remember sitting on the floor, my back against the tub, trying to breathe through a tightness in my throat that wouldn't release. There were no dramatic sobs, just quiet tears and a deep sense of failure. I felt like I had failed my parents, failed my siblings, failed my wife, failed the version of myself who believed he could hold everyone together. I didn't feel angry. I felt ashamed. Ashamed for not being enough. Ashamed for needing space. Ashamed for hurting people without meaning to. That night, I realized how deeply I had tied my value to being accepted. Without acceptance, I felt empty. The next morning, I woke up with a dull headache and heavy eyes. Life continued, indifferent to my inner state. I went through my routine on autopilot. But something had changed. I couldn't ignore how far I had fallen emotionally. I was functioning, but I wasn't living. The realization scared me. I didn't want to become someone who simply endured his days, waiting for them to end. I didn't want bitterness to take root inside me. So I did something small but uncomfortable. I admitted, quietly, to myself, that I was not okay. That admission didn't fix anything, but it created honesty. And honesty, I was learning, was the beginning of healing, even when it hurt. I started paying attention to my inner world instead of running from it. I noticed how often I blamed myself automatically. How quickly I dismissed my own pain. How easily I took responsibility for things that were never fully mine to carry. Those patterns had kept me good for a long time. They had also kept me small. As the days passed, the sadness didn't disappear, but it softened. It became something I could sit with instead of fight. I allowed myself to grieve, not just the loss of my family's presence, but the loss of the identity I had built around them. Grief came in waves. Some days, I felt almost normal. Other days, the weight returned unexpectedly, triggered by nothing I could explain. I stopped judging those days. I let them exist. That was new for me. I realized that falling wasn't the same as failing. Sometimes, falling is what happens when the structures that once held you no longer fit who you've become. That understanding didn't make the fall easier, but it made it meaningful. And somewhere in that meaning, buried beneath the sadness and self-doubt, there was a quiet truth waiting to be acknowledged. I couldn't go back to who I was. But maybe, just maybe, I didn't need to. The fall, painful as it was clearing space. Space for something different. Something more honest. Even if I didn't yet know what that looked like. All I knew was that I was standing at the lowest point I had ever known. And for the first time, I was beginning to look forward instead of only back. The twist didn't arrive as a dramatic moment. There was no sudden clarity. No instant peace. No single realization that tied everything together neatly. It came quietly, over time, in pieces so small I almost missed them. It began with exhaustion. Not the kind sleep fixes. The deeper kind. The kind that comes from holding yourself in a shape that no longer fits. One morning, I woke up and realized I couldn't keep proving my pain anymore. I was tired of explaining. Tired of justifying. Tired of carrying responsibility for emotions that weren't mine. That tiredness didn't make me angry. It made me honest. I stopped rehearsing conversations in my head. Stopped imagining how I would defend myself if someone ever reached out again. Stopped waiting for permission to feel at peace. And in that stillness, a thought surfaced. Maybe this wasn't about who was right or wrong. Maybe it was about growth happening at different speeds. That idea was uncomfortable, because it meant accepting that love doesn't always evolve together. That sometimes, people you love stay rooted in patterns you have outgrown. I didn't want that to be true, but it felt real. I began to reflect on my family with more distance and less judgment. I saw how fear played a role in their reactions. Fear of change. Fear of losing control. Fear of roles shifting in ways they didn't understand. I also saw my own fear clearly for the first time. I had been afraid of being seen as difficult. Afraid of disappointing people. Afraid of standing alone. That fear had shaped so many of my choices, and it had cost me more than I realized. The twist wasn't realizing that my family had hurt me. I already knew that. The twist was realizing I had been hurting myself for years before the cutoff ever happened. I had ignored my own discomfort. I had minimized my own needs. I had accepted emotional strain as normal because it kept things calm. In doing so, I had slowly abandoned myself. That truth was painful, but it was also freeing, because it meant this moment, as lonely as it felt, wasn't just loss. It was an invitation. An invitation to rebuild my life on something more solid than approval. I started noticing small shifts in how I moved through the world. I spoke more slowly. I said no without over-explaining. I stopped apologizing for emotions that didn't harm anyone. These changes were subtle, but they mattered. They made me feel more present in my own body. My relationship with my wife began to change too. Not instantly. Not perfectly. But I started sharing more honestly instead of protecting her from my pain. I told her when I felt lost. When I felt afraid. When I felt like I didn't know who I was anymore. She listened. Not to fix me. Just to understand. That alone brought us closer than we had been in months. I realized how much emotional intimacy I had replaced with responsibility. Now, I was learning how to be seen instead of just relied on. There were still days when I missed my family deeply. Days when I wished things had gone differently. But the longing felt different now. Less desperate. More reflective. I could miss them without collapsing. I could remember good moments without needing them to return exactly as they were. That was new. One afternoon, while walking alone, I noticed something simple. I was breathing deeply. Not out of effort. Just naturally. It caught me off guard. For so long, I had lived with a constant tightness inside me that I hadn't even recognized as tension. Now, there was space. That space felt unfamiliar, but it also felt like relief. I began to understand that survival wasn't about rebuilding the past. It was about creating a present that didn't require me to disappear. That realization didn't erase the grief, but it changed how I carried it. Grief became something I could hold, not something that held me. I stopped waiting for closure that might never come. I stopped imagining apologies that might never be offered. Instead, I focused on what I could control. How I spoke to myself. How I honored my limits. How I showed up in the relationships still in my life. Those choices mattered. They shaped my days in quiet but powerful ways. The twist wasn't dramatic. It was gentle. And because it was gentle, it lasted. I learned that sometimes the hardest truth is also the kindest one. You can love people deeply and still need distance from the ways they hurt you. That doesn't make you disloyal. It makes you honest. And honesty, I was learning, is the foundation of any life that truly feels like your own. For the first time since being cut off, I didn't feel like I was just surviving. I felt like I was becoming someone new. Not better, just more real. And that realization changed everything. The days that followed the twist were quieter, but in a different way. Not empty, not heavy with tension, not full of longing that felt endless. Quiet in a way that felt like space was finally opening up inside me. Space to notice myself. Space to breathe. Space to move forward without constantly checking if anyone else approved. I started small. I bought a journal. At first, I didn't write much. A few sentences about the weather, a note about how I felt. Slowly, that turned into pages. Pages filled with memories, fears, frustrations, and small victories. Words I had carried inside for years finally had a place to land. I started cooking more. Meals for just me. Simple things. Pasta, roasted vegetables, eggs. I discovered the rhythm of preparing something with care and eating without guilt or expectation. That ordinary act became strangely comforting. I began noticing the little things I had taken for granted. Sunlight through my window. The sound of birds in the morning. The way the air smelled after it rained. Things that didn't require anyone else's permission or validation. My relationship with my wife changed too. We no longer avoided silence because it was uncomfortable. Instead, we learned to sit in it together. Sometimes we didn't speak at all. Sometimes we talked for hours about memories, fears, dreams we hadn't shared before. She became a witness to my life instead of just a companion, and I to hers. Even work, which had once felt like a necessary obligation, became a space for growth. I noticed my own capabilities in ways I hadn't before. The ability to handle challenges calmly. The ability to problem solve without seeking constant approval. The ability to take responsibility without absorbing blame for everyone else. And slowly, the isolation that once crushed me began to feel different. Not like a cage, not like a punishment, but like an empty room being furnished for the first time. A room where I could choose what to keep, what to let go, and who to invite in. Of course, there were setbacks. Days when grief returned sharply. Nights when I found myself staring at the ceiling, wishing for someone to call. But those moments no longer defined me. They became just moments, fleeting and tolerable. I began to notice strength I hadn't recognized before. Not the loud kind that people applaud. Not the heroic kind in stories. But the quiet, steady kind. The strength it takes to sit with your own emotions, to hold yourself together when no one else is around, to keep going even when life feels uncertain. One evening, I caught myself smiling at a memory from childhood. A simple one, my father teaching me to ride a bike in the driveway, my mother cheering quietly. It wasn't painful. It wasn't longing. It was recognition. A gentle acceptance that those moments had happened, that they shaped me, and that I could carry them forward without being trapped by the absence of what followed. I began to rebuild a life that wasn't measured by anyone else's expectations. I didn't chase approval. I didn't seek forgiveness. I didn't wait for invitations. I just lived. And in that living, I discovered resilience. I discovered patience. I discovered a capacity for joy and connection that I hadn't realized existed because it had always been tangled up with obligation and fear. I began volunteering in small ways, helping others quietly. I reconnected with friends I had neglected. I traveled alone for short trips, exploring spaces that had nothing to do with family histories or responsibilities. Each choice, no matter how small, reminded me that I could exist fully without depending on others to validate my existence. It didn't happen overnight. It still doesn't. Some days, the pain is present. Some days, the memory of being cut off feels like a shadow stretching across my chest. But those days no longer dictate who I am or what I feel capable of. I began to understand that survival isn't about returning to the old life. It's about learning to live in the life that is real now. And in that understanding, I found a quiet, steadfast hope. A hope that doesn't shout, doesn't demand attention, but a hope that reminds me every morning that I am still here. I am still capable, and I am not defined by the absence of others, but by the presence of myself. For the first time in a long time, I felt that I could stand on my own. And that feeling, steady, calm, unshakable, was more powerful than anything I had ever experienced when I was surrounded by people I loved, but who could not accept me fully. It was freedom, and in that freedom, I began to truly live again. Even as I started to rebuild my life, the memories didn't disappear. They lingered in quiet ways. An old photograph I found in a drawer, a song that reminded me of home, a smell that transported me back to the kitchen where my mother cooked meals for us. Sometimes the memories felt comforting. Other times, they were sharp, cutting through the calm I had worked so hard to build. I realized that grief isn't linear. It doesn't follow a schedule. It doesn't have a timeline. Some days I felt almost normal, carrying on with work, conversations, and small joys. Other days, it returned in full force, catching me off guard when I least expected it. I started noticing patterns in my emotions. I saw how I would default to guilt. I would blame myself for what happened, imagining every word I hadn't said, every action I could have taken differently. At first, that guilt felt unbearable, like a weight pressing down on my chest. But slowly, I began to recognize it for what it was, my mind trying to make sense of a situation that had no clear answer. One afternoon, I went through some old family letters. The notes from my father, reminders from my mother, birthday cards from my siblings. I read them slowly, carefully, and I felt the warmth of connection that had existed before the fractures. It didn't make the current distance hurt less, but it reminded me that the love I had experienced was real. That love wasn't gone. It had just changed. I began to journal more intentionally, writing not just about grief, but about growth. About the ways I was learning to navigate life independently. About the small victories I often overlooked. Making a difficult decision without fear of judgment. Handling an emotional challenge without seeking validation. Enjoying a quiet evening alone without feeling lonely. Through journaling, I noticed something important. I had spent so many years measuring my worth by how I served others, my family, my wife, even friends. And while serving isn't wrong, relying on it entirely to define yourself is dangerous. It leaves you fragile, vulnerable to disappointment when others don't meet your expectations. I began to explore who I was outside of these roles. Not the dutiful son, the mediator, the provider, or the peacemaker. Just me. At first, it felt empty, strange, uncomfortable. I didn't know what to do with this version of myself. But over time, it began to feel freeing. I could like things simply because I liked them. I could spend time alone without guilt. I could make choices without fearing I was letting someone else down. I also learned the importance of boundaries. Not walls built out of anger, but gentle fences that protected my energy and emotional well-being. Saying no, walking away from situations that weren't healthy, choosing my own needs without guilt. It was difficult at first. I worried that setting boundaries would make me cold or selfish. Instead, it made me stronger, more grounded, more capable of being truly present for those I loved, without losing myself in the process. My marriage benefited from these changes as well. We began talking more openly, not about the past or the family drama, but about who we were now, what we needed, what scared us, and what brought us joy. We began building rituals that weren't tied to anyone else's expectations. Shared breakfasts on weekends, walks in the evening, quiet moments of reflection together. Even work became different. I approached tasks with focus, not because I had to prove anything, but because I wanted to engage fully. I took on projects that interested me, not just those that made others happy. I discovered a confidence I hadn't recognized before, a calm competence that came from knowing I could rely on myself. Slowly, a pattern emerged. I realized that being cut off from my family hadn't only taken from me. It had also given me the opportunity to find myself in ways I never would have otherwise. I discovered resilience I hadn't known existed, patience I hadn't practiced, joy in solitude that felt like reclaiming a lost part of myself. I began to understand that healing isn't about forgetting or replacing the people you've lost. It's about accepting the absence, honoring the love that existed, and building a life that respects your own worth. And then one day, months later, I noticed something that had been missing for a long time. Peace. Not loud, not triumphant, not the kind that announces itself to the world. Just quiet, steady, and enduring. I realized I could exist without constant approval. I could be whole, even without my family's presence. I could love and grieve at the same time. I could move forward without guilt. It didn't mean I stopped missing them. It didn't mean I stopped hoping for reconciliation someday. But it meant that my life was no longer paused, waiting for someone else's choices. I had begun to live fully in the present, fully in myself. And that realization, quiet, subtle, unshakable, was the moment I began to truly heal. As the months continued, I began noticing the little ways life could still surprise you, even after deep loss. One morning, I walked through a park near my home. The air was crisp, the leaves turning gold and red, and for the first time in months, I felt content. Not entirely happy, not triumphant, just steady, present, observing the world without wishing it to be anything else. I saw children playing, couples walking hand in hand, dogs chasing after frisbees. I smiled quietly to myself, feeling a mix of longing and appreciation. The longing reminded me of what I had lost. The appreciation reminded me that life kept moving, with or without my permission. It was then that I realized something important. I had spent so much time trying to control what others thought or how they reacted, I had forgotten to live in the moments that were mine. The moments I could experience fully, even in solitude. I started rebuilding my social life slowly. Not with my family, at least not yet, but friends who had always been in the background, people I had neglected or taken for granted, became important. I reached out. I made plans. I let people see me without filters, without performing the role they expected of me. And that made a difference. I discovered that authentic connection doesn't demand perfection. It doesn't demand constant approval or conformity. It only asks for honesty, presence, and willingness to listen. My wife and I began creating our own family rituals. We didn't try to replicate the holidays I had known. We made our own traditions. Sunday morning pancakes, quiet evening walks, monthly small adventures, things that belonged to us, things that felt safe, nurturing, and real. Through all of this, I learned patience. Patience with others. Patience with myself. I realized that healing is not linear. That grief, love, hope, and fear often coexist. That sometimes you need to sit in discomfort before clarity arrives. One evening, I looked at a photograph of my parents from years ago. I felt a pang of sadness, a pang of loss, but I also felt gratitude for the life they gave me, for the lessons, for the moments that shaped me. And then I felt something else, strength. Quiet, steady strength that had been growing inside me all along. Strength that came from surviving alone, from honoring my own needs, from learning to trust myself. I understood finally that being cut off wasn't just an ending. It was a beginning, a chance to redefine what family meant, not only in relation to others, but in relation to myself. I began writing letters, not to send, but to process, to my parents, to my siblings, to the past. Letters that contained honesty, vulnerability, and love. Letters that acknowledged pain without bitterness. Letters that allowed me to say what I needed to say, even if no one ever read them. I discovered joy in the smallest things. Cooking a meal just for myself, finishing a book I had wanted to read, walking without distraction, listening to the wind in the trees. These weren't grand achievements. They were quiet victories, proof that life could still feel meaningful even after heartbreak. And slowly, the space I had once feared began to feel like home. Not a home with people around me, but a home inside me. A place where I could sit with my emotions without being overwhelmed. A place where I could make choices that honored my values and my well-being. The twist of being cut off had forced me to face the parts of myself I had ignored. The loneliness had forced me to find resilience. The grief had forced me to accept what I couldn't change. And in that acceptance, I began to feel whole again. Not because anyone returned or apologized. Not because the past had been fixed. But because I had returned to myself. And that, I realized, was the most profound home I could ever build. It wasn't loud. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't even entirely painless. But it was real. And for the first time in a long time, that felt enough. The quiet continued, but in a way that felt different now. It wasn't oppressive. It wasn't empty. It had space. Room for me to breathe, think, and simply exist. I began noticing the small details of life that I had overlooked before. The smell of coffee in the morning, the way sunlight fell across my desk, the rhythm of footsteps on the street below my window. Simple things, easy to miss, yet suddenly comforting because they were mine to experience fully. I started to take better care of myself. Cooking meals I actually enjoyed. Drinking water without rushing. Sleeping at consistent times. These small acts of self-respect reminded me that my life could be nurtured even without anyone else's approval. My wife and I grew closer, not through dramatic gestures or forced conversations, but through presence. We learned to share silence without it feeling heavy. Sometimes, we didn't speak for hours, just sitting together and noticing the world around us. Other times, we talked about our fears, hopes, and memories. She became someone who saw me, not just the man who carried family burdens. I began reconnecting with friends I had neglected, not in a desperate way, but in a deliberate one. I reached out without expectation, shared my life honestly, and allowed myself to accept support. It reminded me that connection doesn't have to be conditional. It can be simple, warm, and sustaining. Work, too, changed. I approached it with focus and care, not to prove myself to anyone, but because I wanted to engage fully. I learned to trust my judgment and stop second-guessing every decision, as if seeking silent approval from people no longer in my life. And the memories of my family? They were still there. Letters, photographs, old birthday cards. Sometimes they stung. Sometimes they comforted. But I learned to hold them gently, without allowing them to define my present. They were part of my story, yes, but they did not dictate my future. Slowly, I began creating new rituals with my wife. Sunday breakfasts, evening walks, small adventures, moments that belonged only to us, untethered from past expectations. These tiny traditions became anchors for a life that was both safe and authentic. Through all of this, I realized that healing isn't about fixing the past. It's about accepting what happened, acknowledging the pain, and building a life that feels true to you. It's about learning to exist fully, even when absence and loss are part of the landscape. I felt strength I hadn't known I had. Not the loud, visible kind, but a quiet, steady resilience. The ability to face grief, loneliness, and uncertainty without collapsing. The ability to value myself without seeking constant validation. The ability to live fully in a present that belonged entirely to me. One day, I realized I could miss my family without being undone by it. I could remember love without needing it to be returned exactly as it once was. I could grieve and still laugh, still enjoy life, still feel peace. The absence that once terrified me had become a space for growth. A place to discover who I was, beyond roles and expectations. A place to rebuild my life on my own terms. And in that space, I found something I had never truly experienced before: freedom. Not flashy, not dramatic, not without sadness, but steady, real, and enduring. I had survived the fall. I had faced the grief. I had navigated the silence. And finally, I was home, inside myself. A home built not from dependence or approval, but from presence, resilience, and quiet courage. It was enough, and it was mine. The next stage of my journey wasn't dramatic. It didn't come with fireworks or a sudden revelation. It came quietly, almost imperceptibly, in the rhythm of ordinary days. I began noticing how much of my life I had spent reacting to others, trying to anticipate needs, soften conflict, earn approval, and how little I had truly been present for myself. I started reclaiming time that had always belonged to others. Mornings became my own. I would wake slowly, make coffee, and sit by the window listening to the quiet of the neighborhood before the day began. I learned to savor moments that had once gone unnoticed. The first bird call of the morning, the coolness of the breeze, the way sunlight touched the walls in a soft, golden glow. I spent more time writing, not letters, but reflections, thoughts, and emotions I had carried in silence for years. Each word helped me process grief, disappointment, and fear. Writing became a mirror for my feelings, a way to see them clearly without judgment. The changes rippled into my marriage. My wife and I began sharing small victories and frustrations that we had previously kept hidden. No longer trying to protect each other from the past, we created space for honesty. The intimacy that grew from that honesty was quiet but profound. Even work felt different. I took on responsibilities not to prove myself, but to contribute meaningfully. I trusted my judgment more, stopped overanalyzing every interaction, and began enjoying tasks that had previously felt like obligations. There was satisfaction in effort without the weight of expectation. I also began practicing self-care in subtle ways. Short walks in the evening, listening to music I loved, cooking meals for myself, even just sitting quietly in the backyard. These acts weren't grand, but they reminded me that I mattered, that my well-being was worth attention. The pain of being cut off from my family didn't disappear. It returned sometimes like a sharp wind, unexpected and uncomfortable. But I learned to sit with it without being consumed by it. I acknowledged the grief and let it exist alongside the life I was creating. I started to reconnect with old friends, people I had lost touch with over the years, not out of obligation, not to replace what I had lost, but because I wanted real, mutual connections. Conversations with them reminded me that relationship is a choice, and that not every bond is tied to guilt or expectation. I noticed that strength was growing quietly inside me. The strength to live with loss, to accept what I cannot change, and to embrace what I can. The strength to face each day without needing validation. The strength to love and grieve at the same time. And slowly, I began to feel a shift. Life didn't feel like survival anymore. It felt like living. Not perfect, not complete, not exactly what I had imagined for myself, but mine, real, authentic. I understood, finally, that independence is not loneliness. It is the freedom to build a life that honors your own values and needs, while still holding love for those who are absent. Some days, I still thought of my family with longing. Some nights, I still replayed past conversations, wondering if things could have been different. But the difference now was subtle and profound. Those thoughts no longer dictated my choices or my peace. I could feel the pain, acknowledge it, and let it exist without letting it consume me. I had learned, through loss and solitude, that life continues, that strength can be quiet, that love can persist without expectation. And slowly, day by day, I realized that I had become someone who could stand alone, fully, without fear, and still feel connected to the world around me. The journey wasn't over. I still missed them. I still grieved. But I also still lived. And in living fully, I discovered something that had eluded me for years, myself. A self no longer defined solely by my family's presence or absence, but by my own resilience, my own choices, and my own heart. The months that followed were quieter, yet fuller than I ever expected. I began to notice the rhythms of life that I had missed while constantly managing the expectations of others. Mornings, once rushed and mechanical, became a space to exist fully. Coffee in hand, I watched the sunlight shift across the walls, listening to the neighborhood waking up. There was no one to impress, no roles to perform, just me, present in the moment. I spent more time reflecting and writing. My journals became a space to process everything I had carried silently for years, the grief, the disappointment, the anger I hadn't allowed myself to feel. Writing helped me separate my emotions from my sense of worth. I realized that I had survived years of subtle pressure by absorbing everything and giving little space to myself. Now I had space. My marriage deepened in unexpected ways. Sharing the quiet and the mundane with honesty brought a new kind of closeness. We no longer avoided the hard topics, but approached them with patience and care. I learned that intimacy isn't just about shared joy. It's about witnessing each other's struggle and still choosing connection. I reconnected with friends I had lost touch with. These relationships didn't replace my family, nor did I expect them to. But they reminded me that connection is a choice, not an obligation. Conversations became mutual, grounded in understanding rather than duty. I learned to appreciate people for who they were, not for what they provided me emotionally. Even work began to feel different. I took on tasks not to prove my worth, but because I genuinely wanted to engage. I trusted my judgment more, made decisions without second-guessing myself constantly, and discovered a quiet confidence that had been dormant. The grief and loneliness still appeared unexpectedly. A song, a scent, a passing memory could trigger a wave of sadness. But now, I let it wash over me without letting it take over. I could sit with my pain, honor it, and continue living without being consumed by it. I also began cultivating small routines that brought calm and grounding. Evening walks, listening to music, cooking meals just for myself. Each act reminded me that I mattered, that I could nurture myself without needing permission or approval from anyone else. I noticed strength growing quietly within me, not the dramatic, outward kind, but the steady, enduring kind that comes from surviving loss, accepting reality, and embracing life fully despite uncertainty. Over time, the absence of my family stopped feeling like a void and began to feel like space. Space to breathe. Space to build a life defined by my own values and choices. Space to heal, grow, and exist authentically. I realized that independence is not loneliness. It's freedom. Freedom to live without constantly measuring myself against someone else's expectations. Freedom to love others without relying on them to validate my worth. Freedom to exist fully, even in solitude. Some days, I still thought of my family with longing. Some nights, memories and what-ifs crept in, but I no longer allowed them to define my reality. I had learned to hold grief and joy simultaneously, to feel sadness without letting it dictate my peace. And slowly, steadily, I discovered something that had eluded me for years, the ability to stand alone, fully, completely, and still feel connected, to life, to love, and to myself. I had survived the silence. I had faced the grief. I had endured the loneliness. And in doing so, I had found a home I had never known before. Not a place, not a family, but within myself. That quiet, steady realization that I could live, love, and thrive on my own became the foundation for everything that came next. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't dramatic. It was real, and it was enough. The next stage of my life unfolded slowly, without fanfare, but with a quiet depth I hadn't expected. I began noticing the small joys I had overlooked for years. Mornings became my sanctuary. I'd make coffee, sit by the window, and watch the world wake up. The sunlight would shift across the walls, and I realized how long it had been since I had simply noticed the world around me. There was no one to impress, no expectations to meet, just me, fully present. I wrote more intentionally now, not letters to my family, not messages to explain myself, but reflections on my life, my grief, my hopes. I allowed myself to explore emotions I had long buried, anger, disappointment, and even quiet relief. Writing became a way to understand myself, to see clearly how much I had grown even amidst the pain. My marriage deepened. We shared small, ordinary moments with honesty, morning breakfasts, evening walks, conversations about our fears and dreams. She became a witness to my growth, not just my struggle. And I learned that intimacy doesn't require perfection or the absence of grief. It thrives on honesty, patience, and shared vulnerability. I began reconnecting with friends I had long neglected, not to replace my family, but to build authentic bonds. These relationships were mutual, free of obligation, and reminded me that connection is a choice, not a requirement. I learned to value people for who they were, not for what they could provide me emotionally. Work, too, changed. I engaged fully, not to prove my worth, but because I wanted to contribute. I trusted my judgment, made decisions without seeking silent approval, and discovered a quiet confidence I hadn't known I possessed. I realized that strength doesn't always announce itself. It grows quietly, through consistent effort and self-reliance. Grief and longing still appeared. A song, a photograph, or a fleeting memory could bring a wave of sadness. But now I allowed myself to feel without letting it control me. I could sit with the pain, acknowledge it, and continue living. I built routines that nurtured me. Cooking meals just for myself, walking without distraction, listening to music I loved. These simple acts reminded me that I was worthy of care, attention, and time. I was learning to be present for myself in a way I never had before. Over time, I noticed resilience growing within me. Not the loud, dramatic kind, but the steady, enduring kind that emerges from facing loneliness, embracing reality, and moving forward despite uncertainty. I realized independence is not loneliness, it is freedom. Freedom to define your life, to set boundaries, to love others without losing yourself, and to exist fully, even in solitude. I still miss my family. I still grieved. But the absence no longer dictated my life. I could hold sadness and joy at the same time. I could remember love without needing it to return in the same form. I could live fully, authentically, and peacefully. And slowly, I discovered a truth I had never allowed myself to see. I could stand alone, fully and completely, and still feel connected to life, to love, and to myself. I had survived the silence, endured the grief, and learned the art of living on my own terms. And in doing so, I had found the most important home of all, not a place, not a family, but inside myself. It was quiet, it was steady, and it was enough. For the first time in a long time, I felt whole. And that wholeness became the foundation for everything I would build from that day forward. Over time, I realized something profound. Life doesn't pause for heartbreak. It doesn't wait for people to understand, apologize, or return. It moves forward, relentlessly, patiently, quietly. And you either move with it, or you stay stuck in the grief, endlessly replaying what was lost. I chose to move forward, not because the pain disappeared, not because I stopped missing them, not because the silence was easy, but because I finally understood that my life belonged to me, and no absence, no rejection, could take that away. I learned that true strength isn't about endurance for others. It's about being present for yourself. It's about honoring your own heart, even when it hurts. It's about building a life that reflects your values, not someone else's expectations. I began living with intention, small routines, quiet moments, honest conversations, and connections that were genuine. I nurtured my marriage, my friendships, and most importantly, my relationship with myself. I discovered that love can survive absence, and that joy can coexist with grief. I learned to hold memories gently, without letting them weigh me down. I could remember the people I loved without needing them to be part of my present. I could grieve without being consumed. I realized that being cut off from my family didn't just take from me. It gave me something too. It gave me perspective. It gave me freedom. It gave me the chance to discover who I really am when no one else's approval or presence defines me. Now, I stand on solid ground. Not the ground I thought I would have, not the life I imagined, but a life I have built myself. A life filled with quiet strength, honest love, and a deep, steady peace. I've learned that home isn't always a place or the people who raised you. Sometimes, home is the self you reclaim after the world lets you go. Home is the love you give yourself when no one else can. Home is the quiet understanding that even in solitude, you are enough. And for the first time in years, I know it's true. I am enough. I am whole. I am free. And that freedom, that quiet, steady freedom, is the greatest gift I could ever receive.